Alright, so this stream, we'll take a look at how I painted this image of Pikachu. I used Heavy Paint Classic on an iPad, and this is about a minute long um, uh, time lapse of the process. The actual painting took me about an hour, and I did it from live. Weather was sort of overcast, um, and because the toy was facing the warm table, you can see that its field side gets warmer. Um, like all of the area around the belly gets very warm, and the shadow is a very warm shadow, which would have been a different temperature if it had been sitting on a surface that had like a cooler hue or something that wouldn't bounce back out of warmth. Um, the bulk of the tools that I use to paint it are the polygon tool, which we covered in the Intro to Heavy Paint Classic class. I used this to block in the background, and then I set up a new layer for the character. And the reason why I blocked it in with a dark shade, dark over bright, is so that it would separate against the background, right? And then I painted like a little cast shadow. Um, and then I ended up going with like a more warm color for the table, just to reflect the actual temperature of the table itself, and something warmer for the character. Um, and the reason why I started with a dark on bright read for the character is that because I know eventually I would end up with a value on the key side. It was actually brighter than the table, but it just helps me to start with the fill side. Helps me define the silhouette first. So I tend to worry less about the key side and more about fill side getting that right. And I try to get the silhouette in a good place before I start to worry about the form. So the silhouette comes first, and then once the silhouette is in a good place, you can start shaping the character. Okay. So I'm not gonna do a whole live demo because it took me an hour to paint this, but I just wanted to um, give a little overview of how I painted it, and actually recorded the process. We can go a little bit here. So, like I said, started with the background color, um, and then blocked in the character. I blocked it in just super simple, just trying to get the overall space that it takes up, um, rather than getting into details too quickly. Then I painted the dark shadows, uh, and then I started to work on the silhouette a little more, but without getting into sculpting yet. Sculpting, form, those are the same thing. Essentially, once you have the value groups separating, getting inside the value group for the character and defining the form. So it goes from a two-dimensional shape into a three-dimensional shape. And you can see that here I added a little bit of form so that you start to feel some shape on the field side. And you start to feel the separation between the head and the body. I painted like a very, very subtle cast shadow from the head onto the body. Um, you can see under the chin, I painted it a little brighter to start working on potentially some bounce, but I think I probably ended up painting over it later. Sometimes I get ahead of myself and I might just start painting form before I'm really actually happy with the design. So you'll see me going back and forth here. Um, Here I'm adding the key, which as you can see pushes the top of the value group to read bright on dark, whereas the rest of the figure reads dark on bright. And that's fine. It's fine for a value group to have a lot of contrast. You just want to make sure that either it's dark on bright or bright on dark. You want to try and avoid too much of that value group to have exactly the same temperature or value as the background. Otherwise, a big portion of that value group will just disappear. I mean, sometimes if that's your goal to make it disappear for whatever reason, that can work. Um, but typically, if you want something to separate easily, you either go brighter than or darker than the background. Okay. So the progress in the first 10 to 15 minutes appears to be very, very, very fast. You can feel like you're doing a lot of work in the first 10, 15 minutes. Um, but after a certain point in the process, you'll feel like you're not going anywhere, and that happens in almost every painting. Um, you do a lot of progress very quickly, and then you're like, okay, uh, this is taking a long time, and I'm not making a lot of progress anymore. So from here on, and we're only like a third of the way, I think. It feels like if you squint, the image is there, right? Um, but we still have a lot of work to do. Because, for example, here I'm like still shaping it, refining the form. It just takes a lot of work to go from like simple blocking and painting the intermediate stages of the shaping, so the form feels soft. At some point, once the overall key is blocked in, I'm going in and I'm blurring some of the edges. But usually I try to make sure that the values and the colors are just right before I start blurring them. Here we almost lost. I started to paint a little bit of bounce light from the character onto the ground. You can see here, very subtle bounce. And I started to paint also gradient on the shadow so that you feel like it's getting a little cooler. So it's not a continuous value. Then we skipped ahead too fast. Let me go, where were we? Okay, so we've seen that, we've done that. All right, so we were right about here. Okay, so yep. So around this part, you see I already mentioned how I was gonna blur uh, the shaping, because not every edge has to be a hard edge. Uh, by selectively keeping some areas of the image blurrier, then the hard edges will stand out. So it's important to be mindful of which edges we want to keep sharp and which one we want to blur. Uh, so usually when I'm describing form, I try to use hard edges for very rapid changes in planes and soft edges for gradual changes in planes. Um, so here I added a little bit of a rim light around the fingers and the tail to try and really separate these planes out. And here I'm just refining it, trying to get a more precise tight contact shadow under the chin, so that the head really separates from the body. So it's not just a big lump. We're trying to find some more definition. And then at this point, I thought um, the image was never going to get very interesting if the background was just going to be a single plane, right? So I tried to introduce a background and then a far background. So, and then I try to introduce some gradient and some form into the background. So try to suggest that it's catching some cooler specular highlight uh, on the screen, right? And trying to introduce some form. Okay. Here I um, felt like the overall form was going in a good place, but the shape of the head was feeling a little matte. So I believe soon I'll start working on some specular highlight. on top of the character's head. Yeah, here I'm just refining form, just refining the eye shapes, the local color. Um, so painting something this specific hue can be very challenging because we instinctively know that this character is yellow. But yellow just not does not look very good when it gets darker if you just keep the hue yellow. It tends to look best uh, once yellow transitions into an orange in the shadow. So if you try to paint a similar image, you'll find that if you stick with just yellow, you'll struggle. And actually, this is something I can demo real quick. Um, so if we start with, let's say, something very dark here, okay? And then we create a new layer, and we're just gonna do yellow, okay? So if we have, let's say, a yellow shape like this guy, and then let's paint a darker contact shadow, so we can get this the sense that this sits on something, right? Okay, so if I just pick this color, okay, so we have this yellow. I'm gonna lock the alpha so that we don't have to worry about changing the alpha. Okay. That did not work. Okay. So if we just go darker, you see how this gets kind of greenish looking. It just doesn't look yellow. Like if I go very saturated yellow here, and I just go darker, it doesn't look like a healthy yellow. Um, so typically, you have to do a little bit of an adjustment, going a little bit more orange, and that will make the yellow feel a little bit healthier, a little bit more appealing, right? You can see how that feels a little bit more appealing, right? You can't go too red, otherwise it will start to look like it's a different hue altogether. Um, but it's something that you'll notice a lot. Um, well, maybe now you'll notice it probably right away. Um, so if we jump back to the time lapse, if we go and color pick, actually we can color pick on um, so if I go with like a brush dry, let's say. Okay. So if I color pick this area in the highlights, it's a really, really bright yellow. You can see it's a very bright yellow. But then as I go into the midtones, you see the yellow has shifted. Now it's moved towards orange. You can see that it shifts towards orange. And as it goes further and further into the shadows, you see how it moves towards orange and then ends up being a red on the table here. So there's a huge shift happening to make this yellow look healthy in the shadows. Um, and that's part of the reason why I chose this character, this specific toy for the demo. It's because I thought this would be a really interesting case scenario for folks to try and practice. Anyway, let's get back to the painting. Were we already doing? Okay, so at this point, I thought the background, the values were working well. It was a matter of like actually defining what is it that we were looking at. So there were some tiles in the background, and I wanted those to have a little bit more textural detail, and also some detail onto the table. So some like wood grain. So painted those. Then I used the lasso blur to put the background out of focus. That's a technique that can really help. I can demo it right now. Can really help to um, suggest depth. So, for example, this is the tool that I use to soften the transition edge for the sphere. but you can also just use it to fake the full field. Um, it can be a very convenient way to lead the eye somewhere. And if you progressively make this radius smaller, you can make it really look like it's a progressive depth of field. But of course, you can also just use it to like soften shadows. So it has many applications. Right, let's get back into the painting. Let's not get. So if we go to the next bit, just more progress. Here I thought the fill side was feeling a little flat, so I just had it go a little darker and redder, as we talked about. As we go darker with a yellow, especially if it's facing something warm, you want it to lean more towards red. That happens a lot also with skin. Skin tends to look healthier if it leans towards red in shadow as opposed to something gray or neutral. Then it tends to like look a little sick. So that's an interesting bit. You can see how if we look at the hands, they were looking kind of green around those tips, around the highlights. And so I went in and I painted them a dark saturated orange. And immediately you can feel like it's the subsurface scattering um, of the light entering the fingertips and scattering inside. Uh, so that's a really great way to convey subsurface scattering, to pick a darker hue and make it more saturated just next to a rim light or a very bright light. So it feels like the light is scattering inside and transmitting some of the local color inside the surface. Here I'm just refining the form, getting some contact between the ears and the head. And at some point, I don't know if it's in this clip, but I painted the highlights, the ears. I guess I missed that part, but um, the glossy, the specular component is really important to form and shape and making the image look really interesting. Even the highlight on the head of the toy, it's very important to move beyond just diffuse information, which is not enough to maintain interest, to keep the viewer engaged. As much as possible, you want to try and have as many material lobes as possible. So transmission, like subsurface scattering, glossy, on top of the diffuse. Uh, so this is just a little polishing, and it can be difficult to like really describe in detail what is being done. I'm just going throughout the image and just sculpting it and trying to find ways to convey more form and be more faithful to the subject in front of me. So this is like a part of the process that is not too exciting to look at, but there's a lot of decisions that end up making the image look more polished, like adding a little bit of soft shadows under the mouth there, um, just very subtle adjustments. Here I tried to paint a little bit of a Fresnel effect so that the planes of the character facing a brighter uh, ground will catch a hint of reflection. But you see that the reflection is not even that bright. It still doesn't break the value group. And here I played with the opacity to make sure that it wouldn't get too bright because you still want it to sit within the value group, even though it's a bright reflection. Here I'm just refining some of the glossy on top of the character's head. Um, I'm not even sure what I did here. What did I do? Just refining the tail shape with the eraser, just tightening some of the edges. Usually I zoom out to get a sense of how the image is progressing, and then I zoom back in to apply some of the changes. Sometimes if you're too zoomed in, it can be difficult to know what you're doing. Here I'm just refining some of the form again. trying to get more shape onto those planes on top of the head. They were feeling a little flat. Just trying to add more form onto the feet, trying to really define the contact shadows around the feet and the belly. And here I added a very subtle glow around the highlights, even though they're not real highlights, they're just stickers. I just thought it could help them look a little bit more natural. Uh, Here I painted more of a graphic rim, which to be honest, I don't think was very visible in the original, like when I was looking at it live, but I just thought it could help to like punch the image, make it a little bit more vibrant. And here, I think I was painting some of the transition edge next to the rim to make it feel a little bit more hot. So you feel like there's a little bit of glow around it, or a little bit of subsurface coloring around it. So very, very subtle adjustments here. Nothing too dramatic. And I think we are almost done. Just more refining, more softening of edges. So I'm using the polygon texture here. I'm just really trying to get uh, that form, which should be soft, to to feel like a soft gradual change in planes, but in that dramatic change in planes. I feel like we already saw that. We already saw that. So it can be a little tricky to navigate these clips. Oh yeah, this is interesting. So as a finishing touch, I wanted to add a little bit of glow. So I created a new layer and used the polygon texture to kind of create this like halation around the bright areas. And then I just played with the opacity of the layer so that it wouldn't be too overwhelming. But you can kind of tell how it helps to kind of a very subtle glow. Um, and that's the final image. Um, this is the first time streaming, so I think it's a little bit improv. But let me know how you like it, and if you would like more content to be offered in this live stream form. All right. Thank you for watching.